Hello everyone, this is the first video of a video series about the person-centered approach, which is an approach to psychotherapy and counseling that was developed by Carl Rogers and his colleagues. Here I included a picture of Carl Rogers, so you all know what he looked like. Now, why am I making this YouTube video? Personally, I really like this approach and I'm interested in psychotherapy, so that's why I'm presenting this to you. But what is so interesting about this approach? And why is it still interesting to talk about it today? It was developed in the 1940s and 1950s, so it's a rather old approach, but still it had a huge influence in the history of psychotherapy, and there are key principles that are still important today. And those principles concern the therapeutic relationship, so the relationship between the therapist and the client. And Rogers talked about three main core conditions. And those three are congruence, which is basically that the therapist should be genuine in the relationship. And then unconditional positive regard, which Rogers described as a non-possessive caring for the client or apprising of the client. And this involves the willingness for the client to be whatever he is at the moment. So it's a very acceptant attitude towards the client. So if the client feels angry, hateful, or scared, or empty, or hopeless, or even happy, then the therapist is okay with that. The therapist just wants the client to be real in the moment. And this is also what unconditional positive regard means. It generally involves an acceptance of the client. And last but not least, empathy. Empathy involves a genuine willingness, a genuine desire on the part of the therapist to understand the client's subjective world and the client's subjective experience of things. So those principles are still important in therapeutic relationships today. And the whole approach is relevant for the development of some contemporary approaches. And among those are emotion-focused therapy by Leslie Greenberg. Greenberg explicitly states that the three core conditions that Carl Rogers talked about are also important for his form of therapy. And then I also listed a German form of psychotherapy, which is called klärungsorientierte Psychotherapie. I'm a German myself and I might have German viewers. That is why I'm also talking about this type of psychotherapy. This type of psychotherapy was developed by Rainer Sachse, and the core conditions are also important in this type of psychotherapy, even though Rainer Sachse added several different aspects to the therapeutic relationship. Also, klärungsorientierte Psychotherapy is not just a relationship-focused therapy, it's also a cognitive therapy. It has a lot to do with schemas. Personally, I think that the key conditions that Rogers talked about are important for any type of psychotherapy, so not just those two I listed here, but also about cognitive behavioral therapy and also important for a psychoanalytic treatment, because they are kind of the basis of therapeutic work, in my opinion. Now I want to state briefly why I believe that these core conditions are so important for any type of psychotherapy. I believe that without genuineness, acceptance and empathy, many clients wouldn't even dare to open themselves to the therapist and to talk openly about what concerns them. Because the material that clients talk about can be shameful, it can be very difficult for the client, and it can even be difficult to verbalize. And that's why you need this sort of acceptant and empathic attitude on the part of the therapist, in my opinion. Anyway, I'd like to proceed to the next point. The next point is that the philosophy of Carl Rogers has huge implications for human relationships in general and society. And I want to get into those implications as I progress in this video series. And last but not least, I want to give a personal opinion. As I stated earlier, I really like this approach and I think that the philosophy behind it is kind of beautiful. Now, I know that psychotherapy isn't really about philosophy, it's about what works and what doesn't, but still I think that some messages that you can derive from this philosophy are kind of wholesome in a way. That's why I like it so much. Now, you also may wonder, why am I even giving a personal opinion here? Because this is completely in the spirit of this approach. This approach is all about subjective experience. And that is why I'm going to include some personal comments here and there, because I feel otherwise I wouldn't really do this approach justice. So it's kind of important to me. Also, I really like it when people who are presenting something include their personal opinions. Next, I want to list some key features of this type of psychotherapy, so you have a basic overview what this type of therapy is about. First, there's the idea that you help people by providing the right kind of relationship. So that is what the therapist does. He just provides a relationship and the rest follows from that. Now, you can agree or disagree with that. I think that this is a very extreme position and that you should do more than just provide a relationship. But I think we can all agree that the relationship is very important for therapy. And this relationship is characterized by the 3 core conditions that I talked about earlier. So it's characterized by congruence or genuineness on the part of the therapist, by unconditional positive regard or acceptance, and by empathic understanding. The next key feature I want to talk about is the strong focus on the client's moment-to-moment experience. By experience, Carl Rogers doesn't mean some past memory or something, but what is happening in the moment. And connected to this idea is the idea that the therapist should be non-directive, so that he should follow the client wherever he wants to go in the conversation, and that the therapist should have no agenda of his own except being with the client, because the focus is on the moment-to-moment experience of the client and not on what the therapist wants or has in mind. And that is also why this is called person-centered approach, because it's so focused on the client's experience. The next key feature I want to talk about is a belief in an actualizing tendency, also known as growth tendency. And this means that there's the idea that the client has an inborn striving for personal growth and constructive development, that every human being has this inborn striving, and that is a very positive view of human beings, in my opinion. And in this type of therapy, there's a huge trust in the abilities of the client and in this striving particularly. So there's the idea that if the client encounters the right kind of conditions, he will grow and develop because of this inborn striving. So I presented some key features of this approach, and I want to talk about terminology now. Originally, this approach was called client-centered therapy, and this was changed to person-centered approach. And the reason for that is that Carl Rogers believed that the principles that are true for therapy can also be applied to other relationships and can be very beneficial for other relationships. For example, they might be important for a student-teacher relationship, so they are important for education, or for personal private relationships, marriage, for example, or they might be important for political discussions. And he tried to apply those principles to those areas. And Carl Rogers was even nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize once because he tried to bring together religious and political groups that were hostile to each other, for example, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. So that is why the term client-centered therapy was changed to person-centered approach, because the principles are supposed to be applicable to other areas as well. Other names for this form of psychotherapy are non-directive therapy, Rogerian psychotherapy, and in Germany it's called Gesprächspsychotherapie, which literally translates to talk therapy or conversational therapy, and it was introduced in Germany by Reinhard Tausch. So up to now I gave you a short overview of what this approach is all about. And now I want to talk about the topics that I want to include in this video series. Here are some topics that I definitely want to address, and among those are, in this video, an introduction that I just gave basically, and I want to talk about the Rogerian view of psychological problems in this video. Carl Rogers has a very specific idea of how psychological problems come about, and I want to present this idea in this video. And in the next videos I want to talk about the core conditions in detail, the 3 core conditions that I talked about earlier. And as you might know by now, those key conditions are congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathic listening. I can't repeat this often enough because those key conditions are very central to the person-centered approach. So that is why I'm repeating this so often. Then I want to talk about the process of therapy. Carl Rogers had a very specific idea of what would happen in the course of psychotherapy, what kind of developments the client would go through, and I want to talk about those predicted changes in another video. And then I want to go beyond therapy and talk about the good life in general, because Carl Rogers also presented a paper called The Fully Functioning Person, which is an idea about the end result of psychotherapy, what a healthy person would be like basically. And you can derive a sort of life philosophy from that. And I find this interesting, and I want to talk about this in a later video. And next, I want to talk about human relationships. As I said earlier, Carl Rogers believed that the principles that are true for psychotherapy can also be applied to different relationships. I want to talk about this idea in this video about human relationships. And then I want to talk about Carl Rogers' view of diagnosis. Carl Rogers had a very negative view of diagnosis. I believe that diagnosing people is important in psychotherapy, but Carl Rogers didn't. And I want to present his arguments in a later video and talk about this view a bit. And then I want to offer some criticisms of this approach. I want to give a balanced view of this approach. And of course, time has progressed, and this approach is rather old. It was developed in the 1940s and 1950s. That is why there are some criticisms that you can talk about. You might guess some criticisms by now. For example, the idea that it's enough to provide a therapeutic relationship doesn't seem exactly true in my opinion. Or the idea that there's an inborn striving for personal growth. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I will address those points in this video about criticisms. And then there are some topics that I might want to address. I'm not exactly sure whether I'm going to talk about those in detail, but those topics are the actualizing tendency and the idea of being non-directive. I don't think that it is possible to offer a truly non-directive form of psychotherapy. I would call this therapy rather minimally directive. And then I want to talk about Carl Rogers' view of teaching and education, which is also very fascinating. So those are the topics that I want to talk about. And now I will proceed with the introduction to this approach by presenting a quote that summarizes the basic idea of this approach. And the quote is taken from his book, A Way of Being, and it reads like this: "Individuals have within themselves vast resources for self-understanding and for altering their self-concepts, basic attitudes, and self-directed behavior. These resources can be tapped if a definable climate of facilitative psychological attitudes can be provided." I marked the two important parts of this quote. First, the idea that individuals have resources, so this hints at the actualizing tendency, and then the idea that those can be put to use if you provide the right kind of climate, so if you provide the right kind of conditions. And providing the right kind of conditions is what this approach is all about. And you may have guessed by now that the right kind of conditions are found in a relationship that is characterized by the three core conditions that I talked about earlier. Next, I want to talk about the Rogerian view of psychological problems. In client-centered therapy or person-centered therapy, there's a very specific view of how personal problems come about. And a key term in this theory is the idea of organismic experience. And organismic experience is basically anything that is experienced by the organism in the present. So, for example, feelings, sensory perceptions, bodily sensations, etc. Not part of the organismic experience are bodily processes that are totally unconscious. For example, the secretion of hormones or something. Those are not part of the organismic experience. I will give some examples of what the organismic experience might be. For example, the organism might experience hunger, or the organism might experience a feeling of cold air, or an emotion, for example, anger. And the idea is that only some experience enter consciousness. We are not aware of the total organismic experience. So this person here might especially be aware of being hungry, but not so much aware of the feeling of cold air or of his anger or her anger. Of course, the theory doesn't state that you can't be aware of several experiences at the same time. You definitely can be aware of all the three experiences I listed there. But the idea is that only some experience and not every experience enters consciousness. And now we could ask which experiences do enter consciousness. And the idea is that especially those that are relevant for important needs enter consciousness. Not exclusively those, but especially those. And this is driven by the actualizing tendency. the organism wants to grow and wants to develop, and that's why he becomes aware of all the relevant experiences. So the experiences that are connected to important personal needs. Now, the idea is that it's good if in principle any experience can enter consciousness, because every experience might be related to some important need. That is the basic idea. So in this situation here, all the three might be connected to some relevant need. Maybe the most important need of this person is the need for food, and that is why especially the experience of being hungry is in the foreground here. Or maybe the person feels that some boundaries have been violated, and in this case the most important experience might be the anger. And that is why this type of experience might be especially represented in consciousness. Or maybe the feeling of coldness is especially important to a need at the moment, and that is why this experience might be especially in the focus of awareness. So to summarize, all the experience can be connected to an important need. We are not aware of all the experiences, but we are aware of especially those experiences that are important for our needs. So far so good. Now here comes the problem. Sometimes experiences seem to be threatening to the individual. For example, the individual might think of himself as a nice and helpful person, and if this is a very rigid idea, if this is a very important idea to the individual, then the experience of anger might be threatening, as it suggests that the person is not always nice and helpful, but also very angry at times. And even though the person experiences anger, he might choose to not process the anger properly and might still think, I'm not angry, I'm nice. So this person doesn't really process his or her anger, even though the person is clearly experiencing anger in this example. Also, experience might be threatening because they are in conflict with expectations by society or by the parents. Also, taking experience seriously might have scary consequences. For example, the person might really dislike his or her job and might really feel like quitting, but if the person did so, the person wouldn't know what would come after that, and this might be scary. And that is why the experience of not wanting to go to work, of really disliking work, might be threatening and might therefore not be properly processed in awareness. So the person might somehow suppress this experience and not really become aware of the fact that he just doesn't like the job, for example. This is just an example to give you an idea, and you might think this is kind of similar to psychoanalytic ideas where you repress certain experiences. Yes, it is. It definitely is. The concept of repression still plays a role here. So the experience that is threatening to the individual might not reach awareness, and in this case the person cuts himself or herself off from experience, and the experience might still be related to a really important need. And because the experience might be related to an important need, it is a problem if the person doesn't become aware of the experience. The idea is that the experience is still there, it's just not properly processed by the individual. And in this case, awareness doesn't match the experience. And this is what has been called incongruence. There's an incongruence between experience and awareness. The organism experiences something that the individual is not aware of. So this is called incongruence. And the thing is, everyone is incongruent sometimes. We are not always aware of every experience, as I said earlier. The problem only comes in if experiences are ignored over a long period of time, or if the experiences are related to a really important need. And in this case, conflicts might occur. These conflicts can be described as follows. Consciously, the individual wants to move in one direction, while his or her feelings run in another direction. An example of such a conflict would be, I want to be competent and well prepared, but somehow I constantly procrastinate. Or, I love my husband, but somehow I have a hard time being faithful. So the basic idea is that these conflicts occur because of incongruence. The persons are really aware of their feelings and they can't see the needs behind the feelings, and that is why they get into conflicts with themselves. So the major idea is that incongruence is the root of psychological problems or psychological disorders, and Rogerian psychotherapy is all about exploring, understanding and accepting experience, and maybe using it as it is related to an important need. The idea is that accepting experience leads to a different perception of the situation. Here in this example, the person thought of himself as nice and helpful, and because this was a very rigid idea, the experience of anger was threatening. Now, if the person starts to accept and explore his anger, then he might realize, or she might realize, that his or her boundaries have been violated. So in this sense, it was important to realize that one is angry, so one can realize that the boundaries have been violated. So this is the different perception of the situation in this case. And if the person can perceive that the boundaries have been violated by accepting his anger or her anger, this leads to more congruent behavior in the future. So a behavior that is more in line with experience and that is more satisfying for the individual in the long run. So this is the idea. In this example, the person might decide, I should stand up for myself so my boundaries are not violated in the future. Without properly processing the anger, the person would never have realized that his or her boundaries have been violated. That's the idea. So that is why it's important to properly process experience. Okay, so you may think accepting experience sounds good, and it sounds great if you are aware of your experience that you can then use the experience as an information. But what about really difficult experiences? There are some experiences that are really difficult to deal with, and among those are, for example, delusions or murderous impulses. What about those? How do I accept those experiences? How can I accept those experiences? And is it even good to accept those experiences? And the answer that Carl Rogers gives is pretty clear. Carl Rogers expresses a huge trust in experience. The attitude seems to be, any experience is valid and has meaning for the individual, even if those experiences are difficult. And you might think this is a very odd and extreme attitude to have, and I want to present to you a series of quotes by Carl Rogers that clarify his attitude towards difficult experiences. So the first quote is from On Becoming a Person, and here Carl Rogers writes, I can trust my experience. One of the basic things which I was a long time in realizing, and which I am still learning, is that when an activity feels as though it is valuable or worth doing, it is worth doing. Put another way, I have learned that my total organismic sensing of a situation is more trustworthy than my intellect. It is fallible, I'm sure, but I believe it to be less fallible than my conscious mind alone. So Carl Rogers trusts his experience, basically, wherever it may lead. And then he says, it has been my experience that persons have a basically positive direction. I have come to feel that the more fully the individual is understood and accepted, the more he tends to drop the false fronts with which he has been meeting life, and the more he tends to move in a direction which is forward. So accepting experience is essential for moving forward. That's the basic idea here. And again, he expresses a huge trust that the individual will move in a positive direction. And about difficult experiences, he says, I would not want to be misunderstood on this. I do not have a Pollyanna view of human nature. I am quite aware that out of defensiveness and inner fear, individuals can and do behave in ways which are incredibly cruel, horribly destructive, immature, regressive, antisocial and hurtful. Yet, one of the most refreshing and invigorating parts of my experience is to work with such individuals and to discover that the strongly positive directional tendencies which exist in them, as in all of us, at the deepest levels. So there's a huge belief in this constructive inner force, basically, that every person has. Next quote, there's a view which is very well known to me since I meet it in almost every client. If I dare to let the feelings flow which are dammed up within me, this would be a catastrophe. But the whole course of therapy contradicts these fears. he finds that gradually he can be his anger when anger is his real reaction, but that such accepted or transparent anger is not destructive. So the idea is that if you accept your difficult experiences, they will cease to be really destructive. And he explains this a bit more. Carl Rogers states that the reason seems to be that the more he is able to permit these feelings to flow and to be in him, the more they take their appropriate place in a total harmony of his feelings. He discovers that he has other feelings with which these mingle and find a balance. He feels loving and tender and considerate and cooperative, as well as hostile or lustful or angry. So the idea is that if you accept a difficult experience, it will take its place in the total landscape of all your experience, basically, and therefore cease to be destructive. Because you are not only angry, or you do not only have murderous impulses, you have a need for social connection as well. So that is the idea, that there are other needs, that other needs pop up if once you accept a difficult experience, and that those cancel out the difficult experience, basically. So there you have it. This is Carl Rogers' attitude towards difficult experiences. So to summarize, the idea is that if you can accept difficult experiences, you will discover that there are other experiences within you as well, and they will balance out the difficult experience and prevent it from being truly destructive. And you may wonder, could this be true? Is this not a too positive view of difficult experiences? And yeah, maybe it is. Rogers says that he discovers these positive directional tendencies in every individual, basically. I don't know if you can discover those in every individual. I don't know if this view is too positive, but one thing seems to be pretty intuitive to me, and that is the idea that if a person wants to deal with his or her difficult experiences, then the person needs to accept the fact that he or she has those experiences. So there has to be a basic level of acceptance. The person has to admit to himself or herself that he or she has those experiences. And acceptance doesn't mean that those experiences are good or that the person likes those experiences. It just means that the person accepts that they are present and that they are a significant part of one's experience. And that is why it seems like a good idea to me to accept difficult experiences, even though I don't know if those difficult experiences will be cancelled out by other experiences. It would be nice if this were true, but I do not know if this is true. But still, acceptance seems to be a good idea in this situation to properly deal with it. The accepting attitude of Carl Rogers towards any experience differs from the attitude in other approaches. Usually people in psychotherapy are taught to accept the emotions in the sense that I just described. So acceptance here means to accept that the emotions are present and that they are a significant part of one's experience. But people are often taught in other approaches to differentiate between adaptive and maladaptive emotions or cognitions, for example in cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is something that a Rogerian therapist would not teach. There's such a huge trust in the value of experience that the Rogerian therapist wouldn't deem it necessary to differentiate between adaptive and maladaptive emotions. Also, experience might be connected to the actualizing tendency of the individual, and as I said earlier, destructive experiences or difficult experiences will cancel out with other positive directional forces. That is the idea of a Rogerian therapist, and that is why those attitudes towards difficult experiences differ from attitudes in other approaches. And there's a lot more to be said about this. Teaching the difference between adaptive and maladaptive emotions is also a way of being directive, and for a Rogerian therapist it's important to be non-directive because the individual needs to learn how to direct himself, and only the individual knows what he or she needs. And that's the attitude of a Rogerian therapist. But this is just an introductory video, and that is why I want to proceed with the next point. So from this I think you have a basic idea of what a therapy process would look like in the person-centered approach. On the right we have the therapist, on the left the client. I drew this picture myself. I'm not the best artist, I know, but I still think that the picture serves its function. So anyway, here we have the client from earlier who says, I'm always nice and helpful and yet really unhappy. And the person-centered therapist who hears that will immediately think, usually, well, this is a very rigid self-concept, this is a very rigid idea that the person has about himself or herself, and there's probably some experience that the person disregards, because no one is always nice and helpful, everyone is angry at some point, and this is what the person-centered therapist might think. So he might have a hunch, even though he will not express this hunch. So what will the person-centered therapist do about this situation? He will approach the situation with the right kind of attitudes. So the attitude of therapist is central here. And there are three aspects to this attitude. He will try to be congruent, so he will try to be genuine. He will try to be acceptant, so he will try to have unconditional positive regard for the client. And he will try to listen empathically. So those are the three core conditions again. And if the client perceives that those core conditions are present, this will lead to a climate of psychological safety in which the client feels received. And in this climate, he will dare to explore difficult parts of himself. He will dare to explore himself, his feelings. And in this case, the person might realize, I don't know, I start to shake and my heart beats fast. So the person starts to explore his bodily experience here. And then the person might realize, oh damn, I'm actually angry. And this experience was threatening before, but in the safety of a therapeutic relationship, the person dares to deal with this experience and realize that he is or she is angry. So he experiences a repressed aspect of the self. And this experience leads to a better understanding or awareness of the self. And in this case, the person might realize, I'm not just a nice person, sometimes I'm really angry. So this is basically an updated idea of himself or herself, because initially the person said, I'm always nice and helpful, and now this is a more balanced view. And this balanced view might lead to more constructive or more congruent behavior. In this case, the person might realize, by experiencing the anger, my boundaries have been violated. Maybe I need to stand up for myself. So he chooses to behave more congruently, more true to his or her experience. And this leads to more satisfying behavior. That is the idea. And there's nothing self-evident why those 4 steps here should follow from just providing the right kind of relationship, by just providing a climate of psychological safety. And why do the last steps follow from that? Because of the so-called actualizing tendency, because of the inborn striving towards personal growth and development. That is the idea. I do not know whether it's enough to provide the right kind of relationship and if the rest will follow from that. I'm not sure about this. I think the therapist should do more in the therapy situation. You should direct the process a bit more. But I'm not experienced enough to answer this, to know whether it's really enough to provide the right kind of relationship. Anyway, now you have an overview of the theory of psychological problems, incongruence as a major cause for psychological problems, and you have an overview of what would happen in the therapy process. The therapist will provide the right kind of relationship, so the client feels received and therefore dares to explore his experience, therefore becomes aware of the experience, and therefore chooses more satisfying behavior. That is the general idea. And by this, I'm at the end of the first video, and I want to thank you very much for watching. If you have any comments or want to discuss anything, you can definitely write comments. I will read them and answer them. And in the next video or videos, I want to talk about the core conditions of the therapeutic relationship. So I want to talk about congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding in detail. And I'd like to give a short recommendation at the end of this video. I want to recommend the Gloria video, which is a session that has been filmed and put on YouTube. And you can see Carl Rogers in action there. And I really like this, to watch him react to what the client says and to observe how he would deal with the therapy situation. You can basically see the person-centered approach in practice in this video. Also, Carl Rogers explains the foundations of his approach in the beginning, so this might also be interesting to you. Last but not least, I want to state my references or my resources, what this talk's basically based on. So there are 4 books here. They are all very interesting. I recommend them all if you are interested in this approach. I really liked them. I really enjoyed reading them. The first book, Carl Rogers' Dialogues, contains a great summary of the client-centered therapy approach at the beginning, written by Carl Rogers himself. It's a really good summary there. The second book, Client-Centered Therapy, is more about therapy, as the title says. The third book is his most well-known book, On Becoming a Person, and it contains his personal philosophy or approach to life in general, I'd say. And the last book, A Way of Being, especially contains his experience with huge workshops. Carl Rogers also gave workshops for huge groups of people, for 400 people or something at the same time. And yeah, he has some interesting experiences to report about that in his book A Way of Being. It's also a more philosophical book. Yeah. Okay, now I'm definitely at the end of my talk, so thanks again for watching, and until next time hopefully, and have a nice day.